The scalding coffee hit Kate's chest like liquid fire. It tore through her white uniform in an instant, soaking the fabric, searing the skin beneath, and the pain that followed was the kind that erases thought. Only sensation. Only heat. Only agony. Kate's scream shattered the curated silence of La Maison Dorée, Manhattan's most exclusive dining room, where a single reservation required either a 7-figure bank account or the kind of name that appeared on buildings. Crystal glasses trembled. Silverware stilled. Conversation died. She staggered backward, hands flying to her chest, tears already breaking past her composure as the burn spread deeper. Her knees threatened to betray her, but she fought them. Don't fall, don't fall, don't fall, because Kate Chen had learned long ago that showing weakness in a room full of wolves only made them hungrier. Jessica Thompson didn't flinch. She sat poised at table 1, the most prestigious table in the room, the one reserved for people whose net worth required scientific notation, and she laughed. Not a polite laugh. Not an awkward, uncomfortable laugh. A delighted one. The laugh of a woman who had never once been told no. Who had grown up being handed the world and then taught to resent anyone who touched it without permission. She held the bone china cup aloft like a trophy, her diamond-encrusted fingers still curled around the handle, her sky-blue silk gown untouched, her expression carved from beautiful, contemptuous marble. Perhaps, Jessica said, her voice carrying the crisp, weaponized diction of old money and finishing schools, you'll think twice before you ruin my afternoon again. The room didn't react. That was the part that cut deepest, not the burn, not the humiliation, but the silence. The 37 people in that dining room who suddenly found their menus absolutely fascinating. The sommelier who had gone completely still near the wine cabinet. The maitre d' whose eyes had dropped to the floor, because Jessica Thompson's husband owned 2 of the city's most profitable commercial real estate portfolios, and in Manhattan, that kind of money didn't just buy silence, it rented it in perpetuity. Kate pressed her hands harder against her chest, breathing through her teeth, trying to contain what was happening to her body. She could feel the blisters forming. She could feel the heat still radiating inward. She could feel 20 years of quiet endurance crumbling at the edges. Nobody moved. Nobody came. But in the far corner of the dining room, where the lighting was soft and the table half concealed by a sculpted marble partition, a Korean man in a bespoke black suit set down his chopsticks. Slowly. Deliberately. With the absolute composure of someone who had learned long ago that stillness was more powerful than fury. He didn't stand yet. He didn't speak. He simply watched, and something in the quality of his attention changed the air pressure in the room. His eyes, dark, precise, utterly unreadable, moved from Kate's shaking hands to Jessica's triumphant smile, and in that passage, something ancient and deeply dangerous woke behind them. Young Woo Jin had seen cruelty in many forms. He had catalogued it, studied it, occasionally employed it with surgical precision in the service of things he believed in. He had watched powerful people crush powerless ones in every city on the eastern seaboard. He had made his peace with the fact that the world operated on a brutally simple equation: those with power take, those without power lose. He had accepted that equation for 20 years. He was no longer accepting it tonight. As he rose from his chair, unhurried, immovable, the intricate tattoos climbing his neck catching the chandelier light like a warning written in ink, Jessica Thompson finally made the worst mistake of her privileged life. She looked at him. And she smiled. If this story is already gripping you, hit subscribe and follow every scene. Drop in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Let's see who stays for the reckoning. Jung had not come to New York to become what he now was. 17 years ago, he had stepped off a plane at JFK with a single carry-on bag, the residual discipline of 6 years in Korea's Special Warfare Command running beneath his skin like a second skeleton, and a quiet, almost embarrassing belief in the concept of merit. That if a man worked with precision, thought with clarity, and refused to cut corners, the world would eventually make a fair accounting. America had corrected that belief with impressive efficiency. He had arrived with credentials, military, linguistic, financial, and discovered that credentials meant nothing when every door worth opening was held shut by the weight of names and bloodlines he didn't carry. He had tried the legitimate paths. 2 years at a logistics firm on the Lower East Side where his Korean colleagues were passed over for every promotion. A year consulting for a financial advisory group in Midtown whose managing partner had looked at Jung's face during their first meeting and addressed every subsequent question to the white associate beside him. The system, he had come to understand, didn't simply disadvantage people who looked like him, it was constructed to. The disadvantage wasn't a flaw in the architecture. It was a feature. He had adapted. Survival had come first, quiet, careful, building trust within New York's sprawling Korean business community, learning which conversations happened in which back rooms, which loyalties were earned by silence and which by action. Then had come influence. Then had come the network. Then, gradually, the kind of power that didn't appear in any public registry but that made certain phone calls get answered on the first ring, that made certain problems quietly disappear, that made certain people in the city's legitimate power structures suddenly find themselves accommodating when they had previously been immovable. Jung Woo-jin now controlled the most disciplined and operationally precise Korean syndicate on the East Coast. His people didn't traffic in chaos. They didn't leave messes. They operated with a precision that would have impressed the commanders he'd once served under, and they lived by a code that Jung had written himself, etched into every initiation, enforced without exception. The innocent are not touched. The weak are not preyed upon. Those who cannot protect themselves are protected. It was not altruism, or at least, Jung had told himself for years that it wasn't. It was principle. A man without principle was simply an animal in expensive clothing, and Jung had spent a career carefully distinguishing himself from the kind of men who used power purely for appetite. He had seen enough of those men. He had watched their empires collapse under the weight of their own cruelty, watched them betray everyone around them when the walls closed in. He had made himself something different. Something colder, more structured, more durable. Which was why, when Jessica Thompson raised that cup of scalding coffee over a young waitress who had done nothing more than exist in her peripheral vision, when the scream broke the air and the room full of powerful people deliberately looked away, something in Jung's carefully maintained equilibrium shifted with a precision he recognized immediately. Not anger. He was rarely angry. Anger was imprecise. Calculation. He had watched the Thompson name for months already. Grant Thompson's construction developments had been of professional interest. Several of Jung's legitimate business contacts had flagged irregularities in the labor supply chain attached to Thompson's high-rise projects. The kind of irregularities that pointed towards something much darker than tax evasion. He had been gathering information quietly, methodically, the way he did everything. But information gathering had a way of becoming something more personal when a woman was on her knees, burning, and the room decided it was more comfortable to look away. Jung straightened his jacket as he stood. He had a rule about bullies. He had carried it since childhood, since a schoolyard in Busan where he had learned that cruelty left unchallenged simply moved on to find a softer target. He had always had this rule, even in the years before he had the power to enforce it. Tonight, he had the power. Jessica Thompson was still smiling when his shadow fell across her table. And the most dangerous thing about Jung Woo-jin, the thing that the most intelligent people who had ever crossed him always remembered afterward, in whatever circumstances they found themselves, was that he never looked angry. He looked patient. Patient like a man who has already decided how the story ends and is simply watching the opening chapters unfold. Madam Thompson, he said, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear it, rich with the faintest trace of an accent that had never fully softened despite 17 years in America, I believe you've confused this restaurant with somewhere your behavior has no consequences. Jessica opened her mouth. Jung held up one hand, a single, unhurried gesture, and she stopped. I'd like you to think carefully, he continued, about the next thing you say. Not for my sake. His eyes moved, briefly, to Kate still trembling near the table. For yours. The smile didn't leave Jessica's face immediately. It took 3 seconds, Jung counted them, before something behind her eyes processed the quality of what was in front of her and the smile began, slowly, to falter. She had spent 41 years being the most dangerous person in any room she entered. She had just discovered what it felt like to be wrong. Jung Woo-jin had killed his first man at 23. Not in a back alley. Not in a drug dispute or a territorial clash over street corners. He had done it in a mountain valley 40 kilometers south of the North Korean border, in the dark, in the rain, with his hands, as his commanding officer had trained him to do. He had filed a report afterward. He had eaten breakfast the following morning. He had continued his service with the same quiet precision that had marked every year of it. He had not lost sleep over it then. He had not lost sleep over it since. That capacity, the ability to make a necessary decision and carry it to its conclusion without the interference of sentiment, was what had made him exceptional in the Special Warfare Command, and what had made him, ultimately, unfit for the life of a civilian soldier. Men who could do what needed to be done without hesitation were useful to governments in declared conflicts. In peacetime, they became inconvenient. Too still. Too watchful. Too fluent in a language that polite society pretended didn't exist. New York had known immediately what to do with him. His entry into the underworld had been neither dramatic nor deliberate. It had happened the way most irreversible things happen, gradually, then completely. A favor for a Korean business owner in Flushing whose inventory kept disappearing. A conversation with the man behind the disappearances, conducted privately, concluded efficiently. Word moved through the community the way it always does in tight networks, quietly, accurately, with the specific detail that matters most. He is someone who handles things, and what he handles stays handled. Within 3 years he had a reputation. Within 5, an organization. Within 10, an empire, though he would have rejected the word. Empires were built on ego. What Jung had constructed was a system, architected with the same methodical discipline he had applied to everything since boyhood. Clear hierarchies. Defined accountabilities. And at the center of it, the code he had written himself and enforced without a single exception in 17 years. His people understood 2 things above everything else. Business was business, and business had its violence, its necessity, its gray territory where men of principle still had to make hard choices. Jung accepted that. He had never pretended otherwise. But the innocent were a wall no one crossed. Not the frightened shop owner who couldn't pay protection. Not the undocumented worker trapped in someone else's debt. Not the woman screaming in a restaurant while a room full of cowards stared at their shoes. Jung had watched powerful men rationalize cruelty his entire career, had watched them construct elaborate philosophies to justify what was, at its core, simply the luxury of hurting people who couldn't hurt them back. He found it the only form of weakness he had never been able to forgive. Jessica Thompson had just introduced herself to that particular truth. Jung did not follow Kate that night. He had his driver take him to his office on the 42nd floor of a building in Koreatown that officially housed an import logistics firm and unofficially housed everything else, and he sat in the dark for a long time with a glass of barley tea going cold on the desk beside him. The city spread out beneath him in its usual indifferent brilliance, 10,000 lit windows, 10,000 private struggles, and he thought about the way Kate had held herself as she walked out of La Maison Dorée. Spine straight. Chin level. The particular posture of someone who had learned to absorb damage without letting it show, because showing it cost too much. He recognized that posture. He had worn it himself for years. By morning, he knew her full name. Kate Chin, 28, originally from Sunset Park, Brooklyn. 6 years at the restaurant, consistently the highest-rated server on staff according to the internal review system his contact had pulled within the hour. No disciplinary record. No complaints. A woman who had, by every measurable indicator, done everything correctly, and had still ended up on her knees in front of 36 people who chose not to see her. He also knew about her brother. Marcus Chin, 24, a site foreman at a construction project in the South Bronx, a project owned, Jung noted without surprise, by Thompson Development Group. The file his people assembled over the following 48 hours was thin on official documentation and thick with the kind of detail that never appears in official documentation. Marcus had raised questions 6 weeks earlier about material substitutions on the structural framework, cheaper steel being logged as premium grade, the difference pocketed somewhere in the supply chain. He had raised them quietly, through the right channels, the way a conscientious young man who believed in process would. The response had not come through channels. It had come at 11:15 on a Tuesday night, in the parking structure beneath his apartment building, in the form of two men who broke two of his ribs and left him with a very clear understanding of what happened to foremen who developed inconvenient opinions about Thompson Development's accounting practices. Marcus had not filed a police report. He had returned to work the following week and said nothing further about steel grades or supply chains or anything else that might be considered an inconvenient opinion. Jung read the file twice. Then he set it down, pressed two fingers briefly to the bridge of his nose, and made the decision he had already known he was going to make since the moment he stood from his table at La Maison Dorée. This was no longer simply about a cup of coffee. It never had been. That was merely the moment the surface broke and showed him what was underneath. The Thompsons weren't just cruel in dining rooms. They were cruel architecturally, systematically, in ways designed to be invisible to everyone except the people being crushed by them. Jung had spent 17 years learning how to make invisible things visible. It was time to begin. He gave the order on a Wednesday morning, quietly, over the phone, in Korean. By Wednesday evening, 3 of the most gifted digital operatives on the East Coast were inside Jessica Thompson's private correspondence with the unhurried confidence of people who had done this many times before and had never once been caught. Jung had recruited them years ago, not from criminal networks, but from the margins of legitimate ones. Young men and women who had graduated near the top of their computer science programs and discovered, as Jung had discovered, that the meritocracy they had been promised had a great deal of fine print. He had simply offered them better terms. What they found in Jessica's accounts did not surprise him. It never did, with people like her. The truly dangerous thing about the Jessica Thompsons of the world wasn't that they were exceptional, it was that they were entirely ordinary in their cruelty, utterly consistent, leaving long clean trails of evidence because it had simply never occurred to them that anyone with the means to look would ever bother. Accountability was something that happened to other people. Documentation was only dangerous if someone was watching. Someone was watching now. The correspondence went back 11 years. A housekeeper in their Upper East Side townhouse, terminated and threatened with immigration consequences after she witnessed Jessica strike one of the kitchen staff. A personal assistant who had signed a non-disclosure agreement worth $40,000 after Jessica had thrown a glass at her during a fitting, the settlement arranged quietly through a law firm that appeared, upon closer examination, to have handled 14 similar arrangements over the course of a decade. Emails to Grant's legal team written in the bright, clipped tone of a woman ordering groceries, requesting that certain building inspectors be taken care of before Thursday, and the reply confirmations, equally casual, equally damning, the language of people who had bribed so routinely that they had lost the instinct to be careful about how they documented it. Jung read the summaries each morning with his tea. He said very little. His operatives understood, without being told, that the material was not to be used all at once. A single explosive revelation could be managed, lawyered away, spun, attributed to fabrication by a skilled PR firm. But a slow and steady drip, a different revelation every few days, each one more specific and more verifiable than the last, that was something else entirely. That was a narrative. And once a narrative took hold in a city like New York, where social capital was as real and as fragile as any financial asset, no amount of money could fully reverse it. The first leak reached a gossip column on Friday. A forwarded email, allegedly from Jessica to her attorney, referencing a problem inspector, and a figure that corresponded precisely to a city contract awarded 2 weeks later. By Monday, 3 more outlets had picked it up. By Tuesday, Jessica Thompson's publicist had stopped returning calls. Jung poured himself a second cup of tea and moved on to the next phase. The properties were the easy part. Jung had learned early in his New York education that the city's real estate apparatus, for all its reputation as a fortress of old money and institutional permanence, was riddled with the same structural vulnerabilities as everything else built by people who assumed their position was unassailable. Loans cross-collateralized across shell companies. Titles held through layered LLCs designed for tax efficiency rather than legal resilience. Paperwork filed in haste during boom years when no one was scrutinizing the fine print because the money was moving too fast and the lawyers were too expensive to be thorough. Grant Thompson had been particularly careless. Or rather, he had been careful in the way that very wealthy men are careful, meaning he had paid other people to be careful on his behalf, and those people had been good enough to stay invisible during the years when no one was looking, and completely inadequate now that someone was. Jung's attorney, a quietly formidable woman named Park Soo-yeon who operated from a modest office in Midtown and had never once lost a case that mattered, filed the first motion on a Thursday. It concerned a riverside property in Tribeca that Jessica had personally selected, personally decorated over 18 months, and publicly described in a magazine profile as her sanctuary from the relentlessness of philanthropic life. The loan attached to it had been restructured twice through a subsidiary whose registration had lapsed 14 months ago, a technical irregularity that was, strictly speaking, the kind of thing that could be remedied with a phone call and a filing fee under normal circumstances. These were not normal circumstances. The notice arrived at the property on a Friday evening, served with the impeccable timing Jung had specified. By 10 o'clock that night, with Grant unreachable at a conference in Dubai and their primary attorney's emergency line going to voicemail, Jessica Thompson found herself standing in the marble lobby of her sanctuary being informed by two extremely polite men in suits that the premises were temporarily inaccessible pending resolution of the outstanding filing discrepancy. She spent the night at the plaza. Jung knew this because he had ensured she would have to. The secondary property, the Midtown Pi de Terra she would have retreated to otherwise, had received its own notice that same afternoon, a different irregularity, a different subsidiary, the same immovable politeness. He had left her one option, a hotel, paid from her personal account, publicly logged. A single night of displacement. A single night of making phone calls that weren't answered, of running against walls that didn't move, of discovering that the security she had mistaken for permanence had always been contingent. He did not do it to break her. Not yet. He did it so that she would know, in her body, in the specific anxiety of a night spent without the insulation of own space, something approximating what Kate Chen had felt walking home from La Maison Dorée with blisters forming beneath her uniform. Not equivalent. Nothing could make it equivalent. But a beginning. He went himself because some things required witnessing. Jung had people for most operations, disciplined, discreet, capable of executing complex instructions without supervision or deviation. He trusted them the way a surgeon trusts instruments, completely, within their designed function, and with the clear understanding that certain decisions could not be delegated. This was one of those decisions. What his researchers had flagged in the Thompson construction files over the preceding week had crossed a threshold that moved the entire matter from professional to personal, and Jung had learned long ago that when something became personal, you showed up. The South Bronx site was quiet at 2 in the morning. Officially, it was a luxury residential development, 47 floors of glass and steel marketed to the aspirational upper middle class who wanted an address that felt like a rival. The marketing materials featured smiling families in sunlit apartments. The website listed sustainable materials and fair labor practices prominently, alongside the Thompson Development logo and a quote from Grant about his commitment to building communities, not just buildings. Jung read that quote once and did not read it again. They moved in through the Eastern Service entrance, 7 men in dark clothing, silent and coordinated in the way that only comes from years of operating together in conditions where noise meant consequences. Jung led from the front. He always led from the front. It was one of the few military habits he had never shed, because he believed that a man who directed danger from a safe distance eventually lost his understanding of what danger actually was. What they found on the 4th sublevel took even him a moment to process. 41 men. Mostly Southeast Asian, some Latin American, a handful who Jung identified immediately as Korean by their dialect when they stirred awake and began speaking in the terrified half-sentences of people accustomed to raids that ended badly for them. They were housed in a concrete space not designed for habitation, temporary cots, a single bathroom facility, cooking equipment that had no business being in a structure still under construction. Their phones had been confiscated upon arrival, they explained, their documents held by a site supervisor, against debts they had supposedly incurred for transportation and housing, debts that somehow never decreased regardless of hours worked, that grew instead, quietly, mathematically, in ways none of them could fully trace or challenge. Jung stood in the middle of that room for a long time without speaking. He had seen exploitation in many forms. He had operated in the gray territories of commerce long enough to understand that the world ran on transactions that polished surfaces preferred not to examine. But this was not gray territory. This was a man using other men's desperation as a financial instrument, trapping them in arithmetic they couldn't escape, behind walls they couldn't leave, building the towers that would house Manhattan's comfortable classes on a foundation of invisible suffering. Grant Thompson had not simply been bribing inspectors. He had been running a modern plantation and calling it development. Jung took out his phone and began documenting everything, methodically, without expression, the way he did all necessary things. Then he made arrangements for the men to be moved somewhere safe before morning. The Thompsons had organized the charity ball months before any of this began. It was called the Manhattan Horizon Gala, held annually at the Grand Ballroom of the Plaza, attended by the precise cross-section of people whose opinions constituted what New York's upper class understood as reality: politicians, financiers, cultural institutions, the editors of publications that shaped the narrative of who mattered and who didn't. Grant Thompson was the headline sponsor. Jessica had chaired the organizing committee. The event raised money for affordable housing initiatives, which Jung noted with the particular appreciation he reserved for irony that completed itself so neatly. He bought a table. Not through his own name, he rarely attached his name to public things, but through one of his legitimate holding companies, a real estate consultancy that was entirely above reproach and that had every right to purchase a $50,000 table at a Manhattan charity gala. His people confirmed the ballroom's AV infrastructure 2 weeks in advance. The plaza used a centralized projection system for their events, a single network managing every screen in the room, elegant and efficient and, as his technical team established within 4 hours of gentle examination, accessible from outside if one knew precisely where to look. Jung arrived at 8 o'clock in a black suit, alone, and took his seat near the back. Jessica worked the room in emerald green, recovered sufficiently from the week's property disruptions to project her usual armor of magnificent unconcern. She had clearly decided that the leaked emails were manageable. Her publicist had issued a statement about fabricated documents and coordinated attacks from business rivals, and enough of the room had accepted it, because accepting it was more comfortable than the alternative. Grant stood near the podium looking like what he was, a large, expensive man accustomed to the specific confidence that comes from never having been genuinely held to account. The speeches began at 9. Grant took the microphone at 9:45 to accept the gala's Civic Leadership Award. He spoke for 6 minutes about community responsibility and the obligation of success. He used the word legacy 3 times. The room applauded with the warm, well-fed enthusiasm of people who had eaten well and drunk better and wanted the evening to confirm what they already believed about the world. At 9:52, every screen in the grand ballroom changed. Not dramatically. Not with any announcement. They simply changed, the Thompson development branding replaced by documents. Emails, methodically organized. Photographs taken on the 4th sublevel of the South Bronx site. Financial records showing the debt bondage arithmetic in clean, legible columns. 41 names. 41 faces. The bribery correspondence, time-stamped and attributed. The room took approximately 4 seconds to understand what it was seeing. Then it became very loud, and then, as the implications landed one by one, very quiet. Grant Thompson stood at the podium holding his award and said nothing, because there was nothing a man says when the room he has spent decades performing for suddenly sees the performance for what it is. Jung set down his glass and left before the first camera flashes began. He had never needed to be in the photograph. Grant Thompson made his call at 2 in the morning, 3 days after the gala. Jung knew about it by 2:15. This was not clairvoyance, it was infrastructure. 17 years of carefully cultivated relationships meant that certain conversations in certain circles produced notifications the way a spider's web produces vibrations, quietly and immediately and with enough detail to act on. The man Grant called was a contractor who operated out of a legitimate security consulting firm in New Jersey and whose less legitimate services were available to people with sufficient capital and sufficient desperation. Grant Thompson currently had an abundance of both. The contractor's name was Reeves. He was competent, professional, and expensive, the kind of man who had worked for corporations and governments before deciding that the private sector's moral flexibility suited him better. He took the contract that same night. 2 targets. Jung Woo Jin, primary. Kate Chen, secondary, not elimination, Grant had apparently specified, but something persuasive enough to discourage further cooperation with anyone investigating Thompson Development's affairs. Jung relocated Kate within the hour. He did not explain everything. He explained enough, that she was being moved to a safe location, that her brother was already there, that this was temporary and that she was not to open the door to anyone until she heard from him directly. Kate had looked at him in the doorway of her Sunset Park apartment with the particular expression of someone recalibrating their understanding of how serious the situation had become, and then she had nodded once and begun packing with the efficient calm that he had come to recognize as her specific form of courage. He was grateful for it. He didn't say so. Reeves sent 4 men to Jung's Koreatown office building on a Thursday night, which suggested he had done his research but not enough of it, specifically, not enough to understand that the building's nighttime security detail consisted of 9 individuals whose collective resume included special forces service across 3 countries, and who had been briefed, armed, and repositioned hours before the 4 men arrived. The engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. No fatalities. Jung had specified this clearly, because dead contractors generated investigations and investigations generated noise, and noise at this stage was counterproductive. But the 4 men left the encounter with a comprehensive understanding that they had accepted a contract that had not been accurately represented to them. Reeves himself received a phone call at midnight. Jung made it personally, which he rarely did, because he wanted the message delivered with the precision that only came from directness. He told Reeves, in plain language, that the contract needed to be returned. He cited the specific account number from which Grant's payment had been transferred, a detail that communicated, without elaboration, the depth of Jung's access to things that were supposed to be private. He allowed a silence after stating it. Reeves terminated the contract by morning. Grant Thompson was now out of moves, out of cover, and for the first time in his adult life, genuinely alone in the consequences of what he had built. Jung found that he was almost sorry for what came next. Almost. Jung arranged the meeting at the Tribeca property. He chose it deliberately, the sanctuary, the marble lobby where Jessica had stood 3 weeks earlier with her phone pressed to her ear and no one answering. He wanted Grant to feel the specific weight of a space that had already been taken once and could be taken again, permanently, at a word. Environment was its own form of argument, and Jung had always preferred to make his arguments on terrain he had selected. Grant arrived with a lawyer. Jung sent the lawyer home with the polite finality of a man closing a door that was not going to reopen, and Grant, after a moment's calculation, let him go. Which told Jung everything he needed to know about how clearly Grant Thompson now understood his situation. Jessica was not invited. That was the point. Jung sat across from Grant in a room furnished with Jessica's expensive taste, the art she had chosen, the lighting she had specified, the particular shade of white on the walls that had required 3 rounds of sampling before she approved it, and he placed a single folder on the table between them. The folder contained 2 things. The first was a complete evidentiary package, the construction site documentation, the debt bondage financial records, the bribery correspondence, the labor trafficking chain traced backward through 4 shell companies to a set of wire transfers that originated from a personal account held in Grant Thompson's name. Not a subsidiary. Not a holding company. His name. His signature. 17 counts, conservatively, under federal statutes that carried sentences measured in decades rather than years. The second was a single document. A cooperation agreement, prepared by Park Soo-yeon with her customary immaculate precision, outlining the specific testimony Grant would provide, the specific assets he would surrender, and the specific individual he would name as the operational architect of the staff abuse cover-ups, the bribery network, and the systematic destruction of evidence over the preceding 11 years. Jung watched Grant read it. He watched the man's eyes move through the pages with the focused attention of someone hoping to find an exit that wasn't there. He watched the exact moment when Grant understood that there wasn't one. He did not enjoy it. He had told himself he might, and he had been wrong. He simply waited. Grant asked one question. He asked whether the agreement protected his primary financial holdings, the core portfolio, the assets held in his personal name rather than through the construction subsidiaries. Jung told him that was correct. The agreement was precise about what it required and precise about what it preserved. Grant Thompson picked up the pen. He signed without looking up. Without hesitating. without asking a single question about what happened to Jessica. Jung had expected it. Had structured the agreement specifically around what he knew Grant valued above everything else, above his marriage, above his reputation, above the woman he had spent 20 years benefiting from. He had simply confirmed what he already understood about the man. Some people reveal their character under pressure. Grant Thompson had revealed his in under 4 minutes. Jung collected the signed document, replaced it in the folder, and stood. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Grant Thompson one final time, at the expensive suit, the practiced bearing, the face of a man who had just traded his wife for a balance sheet, and felt the specific exhaustion that came from being consistently correct about the worst of what people were capable of. He left without another word. Outside, Manhattan continued its indifferent brilliance, and somewhere across the city, Jessica Thompson was pouring herself a drink, unaware that the last person who might have protected her had just chosen not to. Jessica Thompson's arrest was not dramatic. Jung had not wanted it to be. Drama invited sympathy, and sympathy was the last thing this particular ending deserved. There were no cameras tipped off in advance, no perp walk choreographed for the evening news. 2 federal agents knocked on the door of the Plaza suite where Jessica had been living since the property seizures, and she opened it in a silk robe with a glass of wine in her hand, and they informed her quietly of the charges, and that was that. The wine glass was still on the entry table when they walked her out. Jung knew this because someone told him afterward, and he noted it with the same careful attention he gave to all details, and then he set it aside. The charges were substantial and the evidence was immaculate. Grant's testimony closed every gap that the documentary record left open. Jessica's attorneys, the expensive, well-connected kind that Manhattan keeps on permanent retainer for moments exactly like this, reviewed the package and advised her, with the grim professionalism of people who understood a sealed room when they saw one, that her options were limited to the manner of her pleading rather than the outcome of her case. She pleaded guilty on a Tuesday morning. 11 counts. The courtroom was not full, Jung had expected it to be, but the city had already moved on in the particular way that cities move on from scandals, which is to say completely and without ceremony, replacing the Thompsons with the next week's equivalent outrage. Jessica sat at the defense table in a gray suit that someone had clearly chosen to signal contrition and looked, for the first time in the years of documentation Jung had reviewed, like a woman experiencing consequences. He did not attend the sentencing. He had no interest in watching it. He was in Brooklyn instead. La Maison Dorée had closed 2 months after the gala. The reservations had evaporated alongside the social capital of the clientele who had once defined the place, and the ownership group had dissolved with the quiet speed of people distancing themselves from a compromised address. The property had sat empty since then, the gold leaf interior visible through the darkened windows, the white linen tablecloth still on the tables as though the room were simply waiting. Jung had purchased it on a Wednesday. He had told no one except Park Soo-yeon, who had handled the paperwork without comment in the way she handled everything. Kate arrived at the address he had texted her not knowing what she was walking into. She stood on the sidewalk looking at the darkened restaurant, and then she looked at Jung, and he held out a key, a single key on a plain ring, nothing ceremonious about it, and told her simply that the space needed someone who understood what it meant to work in one. Kate took the key. She stood there for a long moment, turning it over in her hand, and Jung watched her absorb the weight of it, not just the metal, but everything the gesture carried. The night she had screamed in that room. Her brother's broken ribs. The 41 men on the sublevel. All of it ending here, at a front door with a key that now belonged to her. She didn't cry. He had not expected her to. She looked up at him with the steady, clear expression of someone who had survived enough to know exactly what survival was worth, and she said thank you in a voice that meant something more than the words, and Jung nodded once in the way that he acknowledged things that didn't require elaboration. He left her standing there in the winter light, key in hand, already looking through the window at what the space could become. Manhattan moved around them both, loud and permanent and entirely indifferent, the way it always had. The difference was that Kate Shen was no longer moving through it as someone it was designed to grind down. And Jung Woo-jin walked back into its shadows carrying, for the first time in longer than he could precisely remember, something that felt almost like peace. Not redemption. He had never been foolish enough to believe in redemption. But balance. The city's ledger, at least in this small and necessary corner of it, had been corrected. That was enough. You just watched power meet its match. Jessica Thompson believed wealth made her untouchable. Grant Thompson believed money could buy permanent silence. They were both wrong, because one man in a corner booth refused to look away when everyone else already had. Here's what this story leaves us with. Power without conscience is just cruelty with better furniture. Endurance is not weakness. Kate held her dignity upright through everything they threw at her. Speaking truth always matters, even when the system punishes you for it. Marcus's truth never disappeared, it simply waited. And when everything is on the line, watch what people choose to protect. Grant answered that question in 4 minutes. Finally, silence in the face of cruelty is a choice, and choices have weight. Now here's what I need from you. If this story hits something real in you, subscribe right now so you never miss the next one. Like the video, if Young's quiet, precise justice gave you the satisfaction the headlines rarely deliver. Share it with someone currently holding themselves upright under someone else's cruelty. Let them see what it looks like when the ledger gets corrected. And drop a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest and where in the world you're watching from. Turn on notifications, this world isn't finished yet. Our next upload drops soon. Don't miss it.